Hi, and welcome to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast, a weekly conversation with women who found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm your host, Dawn Davis, and this is episode number 3. If you're a first-time listener, welcome back. And if you're a returning listener, thanks so much for coming back. You can find us on the web at desertladydiaries.com, and you can also call us with questions, comments, or compliments at area code 760-392-1293. And please remember to speak slowly and clearly. Your question might make it on the podcast. Today I'm talking to Kimberly Sikora, a photographer who recently moved here from San Francisco, California. She's in the midst of restoring a 1950s homesteader cabin and also talks about how quickly she found community here in the desert. Our guest from the desert today is Kimberly Sikora. She is an artist who recently relocated from the San Francisco Bay Area and now lives and works in 29 Palms, where she's renovating a former jackrabbit homestead from the 1950s. Most recently, she traveled solo around the United States for 1 year, shooting photos for her book, A Season of Solitude on the Road, which was published in July of 2017 with Edition 1 Books. And we'll find out later where you can find a copy of that book if you're interested. She's a former artist in residence at Cala Art Institute and holds a BFA in photography from Rhode Island School of Design. And she's shown work in exhibitions at the Berkeley Art Center, Adobe Books Backroom Gallery, and Cala Art Institute, among others. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm glad to have you here.
I'm glad to be here.
Good. Let's start with the question I usually ask everybody right out of the gate, which is, how long have you been a permanent resident of the desert?
I moved my things here in July when the temperature was 115 degrees, so that was a nice, intense entry into my experience of the desert, but I moved here mid-September of last year.
Okay,
so I've only been
time.
here however many months that is, 9 or 10 months.
Tell me, what was your very first encounter with the desert?
Well, the first time I came here was in 2011. It was my first solo trip at that point, so it was long before I ever had the idea to go on the trip for A Season of Solitude. And so to interact with the alien landscape in the park was a really terrifying experience for me. Really important and significant for what I would do later, but terrifying at first. So I remember driving down the 10 to get here and first interacting with the windmill fields. Seeing all of those like slow spinning giants was a really big punch to the gut and was like a really exciting entry point into this very vast and, beautiful landscape.
When you had that encounter, was there a moment where you said, oh, this is different, I'm gonna have an experience here? Or when was that moment of, I need to live here, I need to be here permanently?
Well, I'm from a small town, and so I had been living at that point in cities for almost 13 years in Brooklyn and San Francisco, and so that was something that became untenable for me, both with the pace of life there, just the amount of people, and also financially. Over the 6 years or so that I had been coming here regularly to go camping, I started to get really used to the internal space that the desert gave me. I think that I'm not alone in my experience of the desert as a place for introspection, and so, as someone who has a fair amount of anxiety and a lot of internal dialogue, it was really uncommon to have a physical place that would encourage that way of interacting with myself. So I feel like a lot of times the big decisions in my life that I make happen in the background. Mm-hmm. So I think over those 6 years of visiting, it became something really significant, and I started to think about what it would be like to live here without really being conscious that that's what I was.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so when that decision did happen, it was on my birthday of last year. I was here with 2 friends, Rachel and Brian, who I own my house with now, and we were in Wonder Valley. So in the morning of my birthday, I did a tarot card reading, and I got, in that, year ahead reading, I got the Wheel of Fortune card, which is all about when the wheels of change in your life start to move at a faster pace and with significance. And so because I had been not really to my knowledge thinking about how this could happen for me in the background, that was really all I needed, this like mere suggestion of moving here to get that going. And so we spent a lot of time on that trip sitting under the Milky Way and basking in that, because it was their first trip, and talking about this maybe future plan where they would have a vacation house and we would have this project together and live here full time.
Fantastic. So from that moment to actual time here was what? Was that a year? Less than a year?
Yeah.
Then? Okay.
A little more than a year, I guess.
Right.
We started hunting not too long after that. Actually, maybe it was less than a year, about 6 months.
And how did you find that process, looking for the place?
It was a little bit difficult because I actually wasn't physically here when we first started hunting. Rachel and Brian fly a lot for work, so they were able to come out and do some investigating on their own. During that trip, we took a little cruise around and looked at some properties, but that was the beginning of how quickly things are starting to go in the market. And so we found a house that we thought we were going to have that fell through. So ultimately, by the time I moved here, we didn't have a house, I didn't have a plan, I didn't have a job, all of these things that had been lined up before. And I did get to hunt for a house, on my own before they arrived, which was, it wasn't actually super stressful. The paperwork and everything afterward and all the adulting that comes with purchasing a house was unfun.
Yeah.
But it was really wonderful to go to all these different homes and get to know the neighborhoods better and imagine what our lives would be like there. I was the first one to visit the house we have now, and it was a really meaningful moment. So it was nice to share that with them once they got here and take the plunge.
And that's great that you have some people in your life that you're sharing this experience with. That's a lot of fun. A lot of people who come out here come out by themselves, either for isolation on purpose or just because they're trying to kind of escape maybe something or discover something new about themselves. So it's nice to hear kind of a different story about someone sharing that experience. So even though you shared that experience with Rachel and Brian, you were out here on your own looking for that. Out here, do you feel isolated and on your own? And how much of that is self-imposed?
Well, I do actually. So the situation with Rachel and Brian is that this project is something we're working on together in terms of the renovation, but they live full-time in New York. So for the majority of the time, I live in the home by myself. And the isolation that I have really chased after here is self-imposed. And it was important to me to move into home ownership and working on that project without a partner. So all of the isolation is also paired with, the roots I have in this community have grown really quickly and really deep. And so I think I get to switch back and forth between both feeling isolated and having some really wonderful and creative people around me, which I think is an extreme luxury. So I feel really happy with that.
I feel like every time I go to an event, whether it's music or an art exhibition, I just am so impressed with the number of people who are here that possess so much different kinds of talent and the ideas that they bring to their work. So do you find the work that you do has been more informed by this landscape?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I was moving here, it was, as I think I might have mentioned this, but it was because San Francisco had become so untenable financially for me. And so I wanted to afford myself the space and the financial latitude to further my career. But I also assumed that it would just be really isolating and that I would make the trade from having more people but no time to just having less humans in my life and feeling more isolated but like engaging with what solitude really meant. I didn't expect the community to existing to be there with especially with all of the artists and like-minded folks who have also become sort of like urban expats. And so having finished the book and trying to get that out there in the world right now, I am also thinking about my next project. So the next project is entirely about the desert and that community, as you said. Starting soon, I'll be shooting and looking for subjects for a project called Women in the Desert, which is really about all of the women who migrated here in search of recovery from something in their lives or transformative change. I think the Morongo Basin, just high desert area, offers a rare and kind of singular expanse of solitude, not just for me. And so I'm really interested in exploring the women who've moved here for those reasons and their relationships with the desert as a place for introspection, sort of the same things that I experienced. Almost all of the women that I have thought about for this project so far are also single. Whether or not they've found a partner after moving here, they took the plunge on their own. And so I see a really strong connection between what they are doing here and now and some of the history of this place. I've done a lot of reading about the land boom after the Small Tract Land Act in the 50s. And even though there were laws on the books that women could own property, since the late 1800s, that was something that there were a lot of hurdles to get over. Like banks wouldn't loan you money without a husband or a partner. And so it was also one of the easier and maybe first places for women to own property without any sort of barriers or inhibitions about doing so. So that was something that really struck me, and I'm really excited about getting that project going.
Have you been to the Schoolhouse Museum out in 29 Palms by the 29 Palms Inn?
No.
I had company this weekend, and we stopped there on our way back home from the Palms. And in the back room, which is the room that was the old schoolhouse, they have all the books of deeded property owners.
Oh, wow.
And you can go and look in the notebook. I was actually hoping for more photographs, but there are every person that bought land, man or woman, the deeds, and all of the paperwork, the adulting, as we talked about earlier,
so fun.
is in those books. And they also have just a small display, a little carousel of photos of women from the late 1800s into the mid 1900s who came on their own and bought this land. So I think that will be a really interesting project. But you might find some information up there. And they also suggested some people that I might talk to for this podcast that are still living, that were born and raised there and knew a lot of the people who really just started the town and like the old families who are still there in 29 Palms. So you might want to check that out. It was pretty cool.
That sounds like something that would be really relevant. And it's, made me think of another component of this project that I didn't speak to yet, which is that I feel that a lot of the reasons that women have come out here amount to what could be described as emotional homesteading. And so hearing about some of the history of the women who started the town and how they did that, I think relates a lot to what I've been experiencing. And it sounds like you also, and maybe what some of the genesis for this podcast and my project might have been. Right. And so it'll be really interesting to explore how those relationships function. And I think that my major interest in photography and focusing on periods of intense change and, transformative periods of flux has to do with the relationship that I have with subjects. It's really nice to explore how to be vulnerable and capture moments that are real and have to do with what they're really going through. But I do get frustrated with the fact that experience and those relationships are limited to just photographer and subject, because obviously you can convey some of that in image. Right. But for this project, I really do want to extend it past the images and have a collective of sorts where the women that I photograph also have an arena to showcase their talents and host, Sarah Witt has her high desert test kitchen dinners, so they can engage with some of their skills and what they bring to the community, and we can just continue those connections outside of just the one-on-one.
Right. That sounds great.
Thank you.
Before you start this project, which will consume most of your time, and the time you're spending putting the house together, what are some things that you do spend most of your time on here in the desert?
Well, you touched on one of them, which was getting the house to a livable state, which has been both fun and incredibly long in its timeline. So, up until now, I've been focusing on getting the book to print, and that's been a really involved and wonderful process. I think that I spend most of my time here both with friends who mean a lot to me. I want to invest a lot into the relationships that I have that should last, years and years, because this is where I plan to stay. But also, one of the things that I was really looking for and that I'm lucky enough to have is the time to just sit on my porch with my kitten and watching the desert life go by. It's nice to have traded the traffic of, Berkeley and San Francisco for the small changes and the big changes of our landscape. So we have a property that goes up against this mountain, and we're bordered by another mountain too, and we get to sit there and watch the shadows move and the lizards go from shade to shade. And now that it's monsoon season, seeing some of the weather come and go, and so that kind of passing time is something I really need and sometimes don't give myself. So it's good to have an environment that encourages that.
It's beautiful. Yeah. I enjoy waking up. I'm up pretty early to catch the sunrise, but I see one of our mutual friends, Teresa, she usually posts a Good Morning Wonder Valley photo every day, and the view there is just amazing. Yeah. I get a little frustrated with mine because I am in a downtown area, so to speak.
We put air quotes around downtown.
Right, yeah, exactly. So I've got some obstacles in my way, but being out where you are in Wonder Valley, it's just so open. I get some of that shadow stuff here, which I really like, but I look forward to seeing photographs from out there at different times of the day.
Absolutely.
Are there any new things, desert things that you've tried since you've moved here, or things that you still want to try?
Well, I think the things that I've tried were all sort of visited upon me, and there are things I still want to try on purpose, but one of the in the first week that I moved here, there was a number of events, both of the insect variety and weather related, where I arrived here by myself first, and Rachel and Brian were supposed to be here, and so I landed, like I said, in this time of no job, no plan, no house, and we had scorpions in the apartment that we were in, and sun spiders, and so for reasons unknown, our landlords had carpeted it in a sand color carpet. Perfect. And so I had this experience on the first night that I was there of seeing what I later found was called a tailless whip scorpion, which is actually a spider, but all I knew is that it looked horrifying, and I trapped it under a bowl and FaceTimed my friend Charity, who's my only friend who's from the desert in New Mexico, and she was like, well, you're living in the desert now, so you have to deal with it, and I was like, that's not helpful. So I think that learning to be brave about things like that I got over my childhood fear of tarantulas, so that's good. And I've learned to appreciate some of it. But that plus a couple of power outages and flash floods, you know, I had identified with someone who camps all the time and is from a rural area, but I'm from a rural area on the East Coast.
Right.
So it's not a land of extremes. So I think all of those things that I, you know, in quotes, tried were a big shock, but I'm feeling more hardened, wizened desert lady now.
Right, exactly. Well, it's funny you should mention that because I had forgotten that this happened to me when I moved into this place, which is an apartment with like 30 other apartments. And I wouldn't think something like this would happen. But one day, I was sitting on the couch reading, and my TV, as you can see, is to the left of me, just to give the folks on the podcast a visual. So I'm facing the TV, so it's, you know, in front of me, let's say. So I'm sitting on the couch, and there is a gap of about a half an inch or so under my screen door. I had my regular door open, the screen door was closed. So I'm sitting on the couch reading, and all of a sudden, a snake just slithered under the couch and under the television, where the television is.
Oh my God.
I was beside myself.
What
I was
kind?
like, it turns out it was something called a coach whip. I checked in with a special ops friend of mine who knows all about this stuff. I sent him a photo right away. But what I did was I called a friend up on the mesa and I said, oh my gosh, there's a snake in my house. What do I do? So I went and got the standard desert tool, which I've come to realize is the broom. Oh. And I got the broom, and I didn't want the snake to come towards my refrigerator because I knew I would never get it out then. And I couldn't sleep that night if I didn't get it out of the house. So it was actually pretty calm. It never reared up at me or came at me or anything like that. But I gently just took the broom and talked to it the entire time. Like, you know, I'm really glad you came over, but you don't belong in here and you need to go. So I pulled back the fringe on the rug so he wouldn't get caught in there, opened the screen door so I could shoo him out, and he kind of just, I poked after him with the broom and he slowly went and out the door. But I was like, oh, it is the desert.
Well, that sounds like a much more intense experience than mine. I feel silly often telling the story about the scorpions, but I think it's also was so terrifying because it came at a moment where I was already wondering on like a constant feedback loop. Am I supposed to be here? Oh my God, was this crazy?
Right.
You know, the fear doesn't set in until you've taken the big leap. So
Yeah. So thanks for reminding me of that.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that surprised you about the desert when you moved? Besides the scorpions in the rug.
Right. Well, I mean, as I said, the intense weather and just it being a land of such extremes was a big shock. I was really surprised that the community was so easy to engage with. I moved here on a Wednesday. I went to Sarah Witt's High Desert Test Kitchen dinner that weekend, but also, you know, something I was afraid of moving here alone is that even though I wanted this independent experience and I wanted very much to own a home without a partner, I had such an awful experience of dating in the Bay Area. Anyone who's lived there will tell you how bad it is. It's the land of no commitment. So I had just been lowering the bar for so long, and one of my fears and some of my friends' fears for me was that I would not find a partner out here, and that's something I've been, you know, looking for a long time. And so, you know, I moved here on a Wednesday, went to the High Desert dinner, and then the following day I was introduced to Christopher at a party, who, as it turns out, is the person I'm supposed to be with. And so even though a large part of what I do out here is still something I would classify as like independent and seeking out solitude, it was an incredibly wonderful surprise to find my person.
That's
just waiting.
Awesome. And I feel lucky to have worked with him at the theater and everything like that. He really is a good person, and that is my hope too, that you hope that moving to a place where people have shared ideas and shared values and common beliefs and philosophies, that that person is somewhere, and when it's time, it'll happen.
Right. Well, that had been a fear of mine, right? Living in the Bay is, after I knew I was leaving, what are the chances of finding someone to begin with, and also finding someone who wants the same things?
Right.
And so my hope was that I would arrive here and around like-minded people find someone. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
We win.
I love that. So growing up on the East Coast, did you ever imagine you'd be living in the desert?
Nope. I don't know how better to answer that. I mean, I knew I didn't want to stay in the tri-state area. I think, you know, my parents were from New Jersey, and a lot of my friends ended up in New York because I went to school in Providence. But I very early decided that that experience of forming community and moving to someplace new was really important to me. That's a lot of what A Season of Solitude on the Road is about. It's about that experience of, you know, hopping coasts in a time of flux or taking a long trip when you're feeling lost in your life. And so I think that there's something about leaving the context that you're accustomed to that really frees you up to redefine yourself. And so I knew that there would be big changes, and I didn't know what they were. because at the time it was 2008 and the economy crashed, so there was no way to plan because no one knew what was going on. So I've never been able to look that far ahead and say, well, in 5 years I'd like to own a home or anything. This all sort of happened suddenly, but I definitely never anticipated that I would live someplace with no grass.
Right.
When you grow up on the East Coast, all you know of the deserts, unless you go on vacation there, is just the saguaros that you see in like Roadrunner cartoons.
Exactly.
So I had no knowledge of what this landscape was like.
Yeah. All I knew was adobe and, Native American prints and things like that, which is ironic. That's how my homes everywhere I've ever lived, even before coming here, were decorated. So I kind of feel like there was something that knew I was coming here before I knew I was coming here. Yeah. That I had a love for this land before I even realized it. So it's just interesting.
It's true. I feel like there's a connection between the hours that I spent during summers on the East Coast, which I do miss dearly. I miss the thunderstorms and
I miss the beach,
all of that.
Jersey Shore, just that whole. I mean, I had that when I was in Los Angeles and would go to Venice usually on Sundays. That was my church. Now the Palms is my church.
Absolutely.
But I do kind of miss that whole Jersey Shore experience. And I'm not talking about the TV show because those people were from Staten Island.
I know.
Let's be clear.
If you're not from New Jersey, you don't know. But I do, I feel really connected to that experience of sitting on the porch and watching the thunderstorms come and go. And it's similar to what I spoke about earlier with my homestead now.
And how do you feel this landscape has served you from a creative perspective? Have you taken on more creative projects? Do you feel more creative?
Well, I think it's difficult to tell because it's also new. I haven't been here a year, and so a lot of the things that I long-term have planned for in terms of a studio space and figuring out what my schedule is and affording myself the time, as I said, to make work, aren't things that I can have and judge yet. So first, it's important to get a bedroom
right,
and stop living in the living room because we'll be doing an addition on our house. And just recovering from the move in general and getting the book out, I think those things have taken precedence. So I can see the seeds of what's beginning, what I spoke about for the Women in the Desert project.
Right.
But in terms of the day-to-day experience of creativity, it's a little bit too soon to tell. So I know that I'll have those things, but they're still in the works.
Being here and feeling what you're feeling and knowing what you know about the place at this point, do you think you've found a place here where you will stay? Will this be a home?
Yeah, that's the plan. I mean, Rachel and Brian are planners, and so am I, and so all of our discussions about the home have been made up until, retirement and late life. So we'll be having multiple buildings on the property, and I'll build a studio space eventually, but we've also talked about setting up a residency program with one artist at a time. That's something that I did when I was working at a photo lab in San Francisco as the community engagement director, and so my experience of getting so much mental space in the desert and being able to really explore my interests is something that I want to pass on to other artists and creative individuals who might not have experienced that or who have experienced that and really need it for what they're working on. So all of the plans do involve the long term. Christopher and I have talked about how to survive summers, so I think there will be a fair amount of retreat during some of the hotter months, to be around trees and things that you just really start to yearn for after a while. But yeah, this is the plan.
Yeah, and I think we've experienced, as I understand it from everyone else, this is a hot June, or it was a hot June, I should say, because now we're in July. So that's brutal. And especially out where you are. I mean, here it tips about 100, but out by you guys it gets a lot warmer.
Yeah, we're a good 5 to 10 degrees hotter in 29, and so the fact that 99 degrees feels cool to me now is kind of an indicator of what this has been like.
I feel so fortunate to have air conditioning, but I leave it on like 85.
Yeah.
And that feels cool coming in from outside. So that's just one of those interesting kind of desert things.
Yeah, it's very nice to be sitting in your air conditioning right now.
Well, I'm happy to accommodate. Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Do you have any interesting podcasts or programs you've been watching, music you've been listening to that you would want to share?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just introduced to a local musician the other day. There was an event at First World, which you were at, so you know. But I saw Megan Hutch there and also in the restaurant today at Crossroads because the community is so small. But her music is really wistful and wonderful, and so she's someone I want to spend more time listening to. I also really enjoy listening to Invisibilia. I think a lot of people are familiar with that podcast, but it's two women. It's produced by NPR, and they explore things that are invisible that affect our lives. So their most recent season was like a concept album, and it has to do with emotions. And I couldn't do it justice by describing it, but I think that they have a lot of crossover with the things I like to explore in my photography. So, delving into that internal emotional terrain is something that is great to hear other people doing in sort of a significant way, because I think it's what I'm most interested in hearing about, and sometimes I feel like our culture's a little cloistered when it comes to talking about how your feelings affect things. It's seen as a very, not logical way to pursue decisions. And I thought about that a lot, actually, when I was considering moving here, because the decision to move here was almost entirely emotional. And so after it had been made, I struggled to piece together the logical reasons behind it, because I could feel the wave of questions coming on from other people and wanting to frame my decision that way. So it's nice to hear people who are prioritizing the feeling part, because that's what I engage with more.
Exactly. Well, and I think as artists too, that's a natural for us. And that's how we express our feelings in certain ways through our work. So
Absolutely.
It makes total sense. Emily, my niece, sent me about 10 or 15 questions, and I would like you to pick a question.
Absolutely.
And see if we can give her an answer.
Oh, this is a tough one. This is something I struggled with, throughout my entire 20s. It says, what is the best place to look for a job? It's an interesting question coming from an art school too, because there are some majors that people look towards as something that comes with a career automatically, right? So I had some friends in college who were only allowed to pick a major of graphic design or industrial design because their parents could see a future in that. And so photography is not necessarily one of those majors. And for a long time, I believed the best place to look for a job was in cities, because people really emphasize that that's where the shows are happening and that's where the culture is. And something I didn't realize for years was that the hustle is so hard in cities that it's hard to make the time. And for me, there was an oppressive feeling of everyone else in Brooklyn or in San Francisco trying to do the same thing as me. So I think, where to live is different for every person. Some folks might have grown up in the country and want to move to a city, but you have to really pay attention to what you need from a place, how much community, how many events, how you spend your daily life, how much you need from, your apartment, and look for a job after that. So not surprisingly, I think the feeling part of where you are is more important, but that's also because I'm someone who derives a lot of my identity from the place.
Thank you. The book, where can our listeners find that if they would like to purchase one?
Well, I would love to have them check out the link on your site, but It's on my website. I have a link on the front page. So I'm printing them through Edition 1 Books, but the orders come through me. So
And what is your website?
It's KimberlySikora.com. So I think that the spelling will be accessible to folks on your site.
I'll put it in the show notes too, so you guys don't have to write it down.
Absolutely. And so it's been a really interesting journey self-publishing. Edition 1 is a really great organization. They're an artist-run printing company, and they specialize in short runs of artist-made books. For that reason, I do wait and accommodate a number of orders before doing a printing. And so that process took a lot longer than I thought, but I've arrived at something that I feel really wonderful about. And we'll be doing a second printing in November. So it's very exciting.
So they can pre-order.
Yes, they can pre-order now, get all the orders ready.
And you're excited because you've been mailing out some of your books to
It's true.
the purchasers, and they've been very excited about receiving them.
Absolutely, because I funded part of the trip through Kickstarter. Some of it was loans. And so I've had this wonderful experience of having my community really rally behind me in the beginning. But then it was really hard because the entire project took an additional 2 years to what I anticipated on Kickstarter. So it sort of felt like I had homework I hadn't done on a Sunday night at 8 p.m., for the past 2 years. And so to have the physical object, to have it look exactly like what I envisioned, and to finally be delivering those to the people who have been so enthusiastic and supportive of my journey feels really wonderful.
Nice. Well, thank you very much for sharing your time.
Thank you, Dawn.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much for listening to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast. There are so many ways to spend your time, so thanks for spending it here with me and Kimberly. I hope you got some insight and inspiration, and if you did, I hope you'll share that with me and the other listeners on the Desert Lady Diaries Facebook page. There were a number of things highlighted in this episode, and you should be able to find them in the show notes or on the blog at the website desertladydiaries.com. Next week, I'll be talking to Adra Jensen, a multifaceted artist who tells us how a chance encounter on a remote Greek island turned into a house-sitting job in the desert, and she'll give you an exclusive listen to the music of Bellstar. I hope you'll join us. And if you're enjoying this podcast, I hope you'll share it with a friend. Thanks.